Timothy Kirkhope, is this a question of President Obama being a bit of a disappointment, or is Europe being a disappointment to him, do you think? Are we not living up to what the US hoped?
President Obama had a very massive domestic agenda when he came into power, and obviously he's been concentrating an awful lot of his attention on that. And I think to some extent, therefore, what has happened is because of the new powers of the European Parliament, the post-Lisbon Treaty situation, I think that maybe he had not got his mind completely around these new powers and the effects that might have on some of the important relationships between the EU and the US.
How much does it matter, though, for example, that the Parliament didn't give the go-ahead to this SWIFT agreement, which, of course, is...
I think it was an irritation to the United States, because I think, again, they hadn't appreciated that the Parliament had these new powers to do so. And I personally have always expressed the view, I don't think it's a majority view in the Parliament, but I expressed the view that I thought the Parliament should not really have used that major agreement, very important agreement for counter-terrorism and so on, as its first attempt to prove its importance. I think that was wrong, and it affected the relationship.
Well, some of us have been to the States just recently, and the main topic was, in fact, SWIFT.
Yes.
But I think we were also able to explain to our American interlocutors that what we're doing here in the Parliament is just trying to make a practical example of what President Obama himself in his inauguration speech laid out as the basic principle. We should not choose between our security and our values. That's the common philosophy of this Parliament, and I think if we put it in these terms, the Americans can understand.
Well, do they, though? Because ultimately, are there not these fundamental differences in the way that Americans and Europeans see security and the place that civil liberties should be there? And they don't look very bridgeable, these differences.
That is not true in my view. They certainly were under the Bush administration. Under the Obama administration, the rhetoric and the philosophy has changed. One of the collateral benefits of this whole business of SWIFT is that I have seen the U.S. ambassador in Brussels more times in the past month than I think I would have ever otherwise seen him in my life. And in fact, to be able to develop this kind of discussion on a parliament level with the U.S. administration is something that was lacking. Can we now, those differences that still do exist, bridge through the negotiations? I hope so. I'm glad to see that Council and Commission are listening to us as well. They are preparing a mandate that is apparently taking into account fully the concerns of the Parliament. Under the circumstances, I think that we may actually have, as Timothy also would want, a SWIFT agreement, a much better agreement than exists up to now, but certainly have one.
But there is a danger, isn't there, that the Americans start seeing this as yet another example of Europe being sort of grudging and difficult and awkward and actually, fighting between themselves?
Well, I think it's also a good example of what happens when Europeans work together and the importance of letting the European people's representation, as we have here in the European Parliament, speak. And it also shows that there is a need for an intense transatlantic relation. Relations between two parties don't always exist out of agreeing, but also having mutual interest, perhaps with a different angle, but something that needs to be worked out between the two. And I think that that's really important, and that needs energy and help, and that it won't just go automatically based on the shoulders of history, which for a long time I think have determined this transatlantic relation. The post-World War II generation has certain anchors that have solidified this transatlantic relation. And what's also important is that we look at the younger generation and how they will view the importance and the topics of the transatlantic relation for years to come.
To be fair to the United States in this particularly, once they realized that in fact the European Parliament had these new powers and was going to exert them in this way, it has spared no effort at all in terms of trying to show us what we need to see, to convince us to be very, very positive. Actually, it's rather embarrassing in a way because our own institutions, particularly the Council, for instance, have been dragging their feet over this thing, and the Americans are now leading the way.
And it's quite interesting. You seem to be meeting with people like Hillary Clinton, key figures in Homeland Security, and they've been more available to parliamentarians than EU governments have. Is that a fair impression?
That's also a fact, and it's also part of the problem that the presidencies and the Council have not really given a true account of what Lisbon would imply to their American counterparts. We've come across clear evidence that they discounted the parliament in a way and made their American partners believe that you didn't have to watch out for that. So this is, I think, has been quite an educational moment, and the American administration, having been in a situation where they had to deal with Congress on so many issues for a long time, I think they will be able to put up with that.
That's part of the culture.
Let me add to that. I absolutely agree. Look, they just went through a bizarre fight in their own Congress for the health care reform. I am sure, in terms of the question of how the Americans are looking at the European Parliament, that they've had to deal with worse situations. You know, when they have to, muster their own people, and they have breakups in their own parties, and they win by only a few votes and all that stuff. So I wouldn't be too concerned there at all. What I am concerned about is to ensure that in the negotiations that now ensue, everyone approaches them with extremely good spirit. I can disagree with someone intellectually and sometimes politically, but what was endangered in the past few weeks is the spirit of our relationship. The Americans were unbelievably angry for the reasons you described. The European Council and Commission were confused and angry as well, and the Parliament took a strong stand, sometimes in anger. What our rapporteur said in the plenary, I think, is key for the SWIFT issue. What would U.S. Congress have done had the U.S. administration went and told them that we will transfer bulk data to Europe of Americans' banking transactions? The Congress would have clearly said no. This is what we said here. Okay. There's nothing crazy about this.
Okay, let's just move on, because obviously this is the sort of urgent business on the agenda, but actually there are more perhaps important issues ahead. Afghanistan, areas of foreign policy where potentially that relationship will be tested. Now, I mean, Marietje, you come from the Netherlands, where how much that country should contribute to the effort in Afghanistan actually broke the government up the other day. Do you think the US appreciate the level of domestic opinion around Europe against these sort of military operations, and how does that work?
Well, they will have to see to this, but I think it must have been a surprise to many people within the Netherlands as well, and also across Europe, because the responses to the breakup of the government over the commitment of troops in Afghanistan, or at least the perspective of the future on commitment in the international community by the Dutch and taking responsibility in Afghanistan, I think shows one of the dilemmas we face throughout Europe, which is shared interests also come with shared responsibilities, and to what extent are we on the European side willing to take those? And I think the SWIFT vote, to come back to that, was a good example of how Europeans were again united behind, let's say, a common enemy. But how does it work when we have the ball in our court, as we do now? How do we come together on our own initiative as opposed to against another?
Yes. I mean, I think also it underlines something else, and that is the United States, the new administration of the United States, has to look very carefully at its international relationships, i.e., does it look at the EU as an entity more than it now looks at the special relationships which have existed traditionally, like the one with the UK, for instance, which we think is very important? What is its attitude towards NATO now? NATO is a major alliance across the Atlantic, and one which I personally am very much in support of, and in future defence requirements, what is going to happen to the American commitment to NATO? It's those sort of things which Obama has to deal with against the background of a very big domestic agenda. It's very difficult for him to concentrate on everything at the same time. But
it's also very difficult to deal with a Europe which looks divided and still looks divided in terms of its foreign policy positions, for example.
And Europe will not have a common foreign policy, at least for as long as anybody of us would be a member of this parliament, I expect. The strong national traditions are still going to play a major role for years to come. I don't think that this would hinder, as it hasn't in the past, the United States and Europe of finding a common agenda. When you talk Afghanistan, you have to realize that for so much time, the Americans were not ready to really talk with us about how to wage that effort successfully. The Bush administration has pursued policies that were clearly counterproductive, and Obama, when he came into office, tried to turn it around. He had a major strategic shift in place, and now he's trying to catch up. But obviously, time has been lost. It's been the Dutch and the Canadians, for instance, who've been giving positive examples of how to be successful in Afghanistan, and the Americans wouldn't heed that kind of advice for very long. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense to do finger pointing this way or the other. In the end, we have to be successful together, and it does not come as natural as it would have in the past. In the past, the United States were strong globally because they were the dominating Atlantic power. There's this tectonic shift in the world, and in the future, the United States will be more important because of the Pacific stance that they have. And if we don't see that clearly, we're going to be lost.
Stavros, what do you see as the main challenges for this relationship, though? I mean, do you think Europe needs to help Obama to deliver something on this in this area?
Sure, in general, but look, I think Obama, the problem that the Americans are facing today is that they realize that in this new world we live in, many of the things, even virtuous things they want to impose, are very difficult to do. I mean, the examples of the Middle East, where they are today in a major disagreement with the Israelis, their traditional Americans' very close ally, with Netanyahu doing virtually whatever he wants to, and them finding themselves incapable of imposing any type of pressure to change that.
In fact, they find themselves more in a position that we found ourselves in as Europeans for a long time vis-à-vis Israel.
Yes, so that's one example. The second example is Iran. Obama has clearly changed the rhetoric, and rightly so in my view. He's been trying to have a coalition around in order to push Iran, but not through the immediate first step threat of force. Now, given that weakness, which is objective, I think there's a second issue that ties again with the issue of Israel and other situations around the world, which is if you cannot actually impose your power that easily, can you at least try to be consistent with your moral message?
Yeah, but
what is missing around the world today, in my view, is more than a common foreign policy, a common rhetoric on what exactly we stand for.
We can't even agree in Europe on the foreign policy elements. We have different priorities, and Afghanistan, our commitment to it or not, is a case in point. So I think
but your party doesn't want agreement. I mean, your party says there shouldn't be a common
I agree. There are a variety of positions here, and that is why the United States has to decide if it is going to be interfaced with the EU as opposed to interfaced with individual nation states in the EU. And this is a kind of dilemma for Obama and for us as well.
But isn't it more Europe's problem than Obama's?
Well, Europe has to be very careful not to become irrelevant in the world stage. I think this internal quarrel is really risking division and conquer techniques that are played on different states. I mean, in relation to Iran, this is happening. In relation to Russia, this is happening. So we have to be very much aware, and I'm more hopeful than my colleague here, that we do focus on a common foreign policy, and we can be complementary, but we have to coordinate in order not to be irrelevant, because then we all lose.
I mean, you only have to look at the sort of whole mess surrounding the setting up of the External Action Service and who's running it, who's in charge.
Don't call it a mess before it's been sorted out. And to give you a very small example...
Well, I mean, Baroness Ashton herself called it messy last Strasbourg session, so I'm only quoting her.
That's not the same thing. Messy is not a mess, necessarily. It could be. Might be.
And a specific example of what we're doing on the ground. The Europeans have been quite successful with Mission Atalanta off the coast of Somalia. Now we're doing a second mission to do training for soldiers. For the first time ever, the United States are combining their efforts with a CSDP mission. And if there is rhetoric out there saying, why would anybody consider the European common security and defense policy as relevant? The facts on the ground show that the Americans are trying to get involved with us.
That's not getting a full EU-US interface on these important matters. I think that the Americans are doing it right at the moment. I think we should cooperate as far as we can with them. And I hope the Parliament will do that.